Muy buenos días. Bueno, yo creo que podemos empezar y les quiero pedir disculpas por empezar un poco, unos minutos atrasados, pero ahora estamos todos y quiero darles una bienvenida a todas y todos desde Madrid. Me llamo Luise Rürup y soy la directora de la Fundación Friedrich-Ebert en España. Y me alegro muchísimo que hoy tenemos oportunidad de discutir una pregunta de alta prioridad y alta preocupación. ¿Qué futuro para la socialdemocracia? Una pregunta sumamente interesante y actual. Los partidos socialdemócratas han jugado un papel primordial en el desarrollo posguerra, en reestablecer nuestras democracias y el estado de bienestar, la integración europea. Y desde 2 décadas hemos visto el declive de los partidos socialdemócratas en muchas partes de Europa, con una excepción tal vez en la península ibérica, en Portugal y en España, pero en general el descenso de su caudal electoral en la mayoría de los países europeos es muy notable. ¿Qué pasó exactamente, por ejemplo, en países como Alemania? ¿Y hubo un trasvase de los partidos socialdemócratas hacia la extrema derecha? Muchos análisis han señalado que ocurre exactamente esto. Hoy queremos presentar y discutir los resultados de una investigación sumamente interesante y reciente, cuyo autor, Tarik Abou-Chadi, es con nosotras en este momento y que nos va a dar una interpretación distinta y muy interesante. Quisiera recordarles brevemente una frase del socialdemócrata muy conocido y long-standing chanciller de Alemania, Willy Brandt, del noviembre de 1992. Dijo: nada es natural y muy poco dura. Por lo tanto, recuerda tu fuerza y cada tiempo quiere sus propias respuestas y hay que estar a su nivel si se quiere hacer bien o el bien. ¿Cómo podemos entender los cambios en la sociedad, en el electoral, en los paisajes políticos? ¿Cuáles son los cambios obvios y bien investigados? ¿Y cuáles son las transformaciones menos notadas, más escondidas, menos conocidas? ¿Cómo podemos tener un debate más focalizado y al mismo tiempo amplio, con el público? ¿Y cómo podemos tener un discurso profundo y al mismo tiempo más accesible y visible? ¿Qué es lo que pasa en los países, por ejemplo, en Alemania, pero también en otros países en Europa, en Italia, por ejemplo? Con estas preguntas y preocupaciones en mente, la Agenda Pública y la Fundación Friedrich-Ebert pensaron en una nueva plataforma para el discurso sobre la socialdemocracia en una forma transnacional, basada en investigaciones y análisis científica con participación de políticas y políticos activos. Y esta estamos lanzando hoy. Deseamos que la Agenda SocialDem, como lo hemos llamado, va a ser un punto de encuentro, de debate, de aprendizaje para la democracia, para el diálogo europeo y para el movimiento socialdemócrata. Junto con Marc López, bien conocida en el mundo progresista y el jefe de la Agenda Pública, y también junto con Alberto López, el coordinador de esta sección, y ojalá con todas vosotras y ustedes vamos a trabajar hacia un futuro más seguro, sostenible, social y democrático. Quiero dar la bienvenida y también las gracias a Lina Gálvez, diputada socialista del Parlamento Europeo, que está ahora con nosotras desde Bruselas, supongo, o tal vez desde Estrasburgo, y a Tarik Abou-Chadi, profesor de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Zurich. Muchísimas gracias por vuestra participación. Hoy nos consideramos muy afortunadas contar con ustedes y vosotras. Y también quiero saludar al moderador y coordinador de la nueva Agenda SocialDem, como sección focalizada en la Agenda Pública, a Alberto López. Gracias a todas y todos, y ahora podemos empezar y quiero dar la palabra a Marc López, supongo que ya está con nosotras en el enlace. Gracias.
Bueno, hola a todos. En principio, muchas gracias, Luisa, por darnos paso. Marc no puede estar ahora mismo, pero soy yo el que da pie a esta conversación. Quería primero daros a todas y a todos la bienvenida a esta nueva sección de socialdemocracia que hemos llamado Agenda SocialDem, en la que tengo el placer de coordinar en colaboración con Agenda Pública y la Fundación Ebert. Esta edición incluirá artículos, entrevistas y conversaciones con lo más destacado del ámbito de la socialdemocracia. Investigadores, políticos, estudiosos de todo tipo a lo largo y ancho de Europa participarán. Hoy, para dar el pistoletazo de salida, hemos decidido contar con dos voces destacadas sobre este tema. En lo que sigue tendremos una conversación con dos nombres clave en el estudio y el devenir de la socialdemocracia europea. La conversación será en inglés, pero también podrá seguirse en español gracias a un equipo de intérpretes. Podéis cambiar el idioma en el icono este que hay aquí abajo del planeta. Ahí podréis desactivar la interpretación o seguir la presentación en inglés o en español también. También podéis hacer preguntas en el botón habilitado para ello. Creo que está lo de preguntas y respuestas. También podéis ponerlas en el chat si lo preferís. Y bueno, sin más, paso a presentar a los invitados. A partir de ahora hablaré en inglés. So first, Lina Gálvez is a Spanish economic historian and politician and member of the European Parliament since 2019. She was Minister of Knowledge, Research and University of the Regional Government of Andalusia from 2018 to 2019. She's an expert in feminist economics and member of the Economists Without Borders. She's full professor in History of Economics in Universidad Pablo de Olavide. Right now, she's in charge of the framework presentation of the 40th Federal Congress of PSOE that will shape the programmatic future of the Spanish socialists. Welcome, Lina.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Then we will also have Tarik Abou-Chadi, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science in the University of Zurich, although in fall he will be joining University of Oxford. Before joining both Oxford and Zurich, he was a postdoc researcher and lecturer in the chair of comparative politics in Humboldt University, Berlin, where he also did his PhD. His ongoing research explores parties and voters' reactions to the transformations of post-industrial societies, with a particular focus on social democratic parties. Welcome, Tarik. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So, yes, so let me first start with a direct question for you, Tarik. Over the last decades, there has been a decline of Western social democratic parties. We know there is a social structure side in this story. The industrial working class and the unions from which social democrats drew their support have substantially eroded, while as Europe's population ages, the electoral influence of older, more conservative demographics has grown. What is less known is the supply side, the party side. To what extent social democratic parties themselves have had any role in this story of loss of support?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's already a quite big and difficult question to answer for the start. I think what we should distinguish are three sets of factors. The first set is long-term structural developments, and you've already mentioned this, right? So we have deindustrialization, we have a change of the labor market, but also changing family structures, for example, these general long-term trends that have affected what the electorate looks like, and that have also led to a general development of fragmentation. So this is the backdrop against which we should interpret every development of social democratic parties. We then have these mid-range and shorter range effects. And the short range effects, again, we as political scientists aren't necessarily the best to explain, because every election has dozens and dozens of factors. And what we are often interested in are more general patterns. So we work in this mid-range world. And there, you're right, the question is, how have social democratic parties acted? And this can indeed affect their vote changes over a certain period of time. Again, there it's not that we can say this is what's right and this is what's wrong, right? So I think it's important that every time you hear someone say social democrats should do this and they should change their policy positions in that direction and then they will be successful again, that's certainly not a very scientific perspective on where social democratic parties are going. It's like I fear I've not really answered your questions what they should do or how it's been their own fault. But I think we can come back to this, and I think the important realization is that every policy position comes with trade-offs. There are different parts of the electorate that will be appealed to by, let's say, a more progressive position, often educated voters and so on. On the other hand, this might alienate other voters. And so the world of social democratic party politics is definitely a world of trade-offs. So there's not one strategy that's been more or less successful.
Okay, so nonetheless, there are different experiences in different countries, right? In France, the socialists are barely around. At most recent elections in Netherlands, the Dutch Labour Party appeared stuck in an unhappy 5%. Then there's Greece, Czech Republic. But then by contrast, the social democratic parties in Iberia, Malta and Scandinavia are hanging on. Lina, learning from your experience, both as a member of the Socialist Party of Europe and as an academic also, why these contrasting paths even take place? Do the rest of social democratic parties have something to learn from the resisting sisters of the South and North?
So, well, thank you. So, hello from Strasbourg. We are in the plenary, so I have to shift my mind. I was on the DSA with a Digital Services Act, which is to file into with now. But yes, I have to say that I'm very because he's a political scientist, and I really looking forward his research, because it will be very important for the Social Democrats parties, but also I will say also for the future of Europe and our well-being, because I think it will be a good learning. So I will say that we cannot analyze the different evolution Democrat parties in each country without this long-term trends. I think that is very important to also to highlight this long-term trends. I mean, all the neoliberal revolution, the globalization, also the techno-populist dynamic, also the construction of within Europe, the European Union, and there has been in the last years after Maastricht, and especially after the 2012 treaty, very neoliberal, so very against the proper scope of socialist party, of social justice and dignity and so on and so forth. So we really need to understand also how the different countries are the position they play within the European Union, also to understand the limitation and the scope of the different countries, and also also the cultural and the narrative behind. Because what has happened with some central countries, or even you mentioned it, in the case of Holland, is that we are doing is a very egoist narrative in a way. So we are doing well because we are very good, and we are allowing lending our money to others without thinking that even the design is creating such inequalities and such imbalances. So the idea we have probably not explained to people, we cannot have it all. I mean, we cannot be integrated in a sort of global or European market without developing any solidarity, a real solidarity inside, because different territories have get into this union from different angles. and perspective and situations. So I think we really need to understand also how each country is in this this picture, this whole picture, in order to understand which are the real chances of social democracy in the different countries. Spain, Portugal suffer very much from austerity policies, really very much. We're really very much against people, but also against some countries. And that also could explain the reaction and changes within social democrats parties within Spain and Portugal, that in the last year came out with sort of a more progressive, more clearly progressive portfolio. And so why that could be also the reason of their success. But we really need to understand as well the position of Portugal and Spain and what has happened in these last decades and last years with the evolution within the whole European Union.
That is very interesting. It's true that like, because we have different type of successful social democratic parties, we have the South and we have the Nordic ones. It seems difficult to grasp what is the secret of success. Also, like from a scientific point of view, as Tarik was mentioning, it's something that is very hard to do with when you just have like few cases and so many different variables really involved in this, no? So the rather resistant social democrats have deployed very different strategies in different contexts, both in the cultural and in the economic dimension. As Lina was saying, in the South, we see like a more progressive type of cohesive portfolio. So, for example, we had Antonio Costa saying we won't tolerate any xenophobic rhetoric. He's the Prime Minister of Socialist Prime Minister of Portugal. Then we have the Danish socialist government, meanwhile, that calls for a control of non-Western immigration. Also in Spain, there has been a heated internal debate in the government on the advancement of transgender rights, leading to the blocking of the recognition of non-binary Spanish citizens. Another recent example comes from Sweden. In Sweden, as a result of a failed rent reform claimed by the left, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven lost a no confidence vote 2 weeks ago. So, and meanwhile, there is a popular experience of the progressive government of Berlin introducing a 5-year rent cap. So at the end, we have like these contrasting stories, like more progressive oriented socialist parties that are successful in the North, and maybe a bit like also quite successful socialist parties in the South that are implementing like a rather different type of agenda. My question here is, how do you see these contrasting stories? What is or what should be the agenda of the socialists for our modern European society, Lina? Is it should it balance differently in the South and the North? Should it continue like with diverging paths, or should it be like a more cohesive type of story to tell from the socialists?
So on the one hand, we really need to include more flexibility on economic governance. And on this respect, we could like integrate, we will do better if we look for an economic governance. I mean, we have now the growth and stability plan, even if now it's in a kind of standby, but it will continue. We should really go to transform this plan, which give no flexibility to the different national situations. So this is, in this case, we really need to go for a more flexible rules in the economic governance. Otherwise, they will be very neoliberal and limiting rules. So that's on the one side. But on the other side, I think the I hope now it's okay because I'm with using the phone. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, because I have a phone call, and sorry about that. And sorry. But on the other hand, I think we should not go for the nationalistic. I mean, we will do not very well if we take this nationalistic approach in every country, like some Nordic countries are doing right now, for instance, with going against the the directive of minimum wages in Europe, or their view in front of migrants. And so this is a very nationalistic, at the end, and non-solidarity way that I don't think it is really on the core of the social democrat sort of future, in a way. So we really need to arrive to a kind of balance, and we should go towards sort of more flexibility and changing the economic governance that now that's not allow national differences or is not very well thought in order to apply to different needs of the population in the different places. But on the other hand, we should avoid to get into this very nationalistic sort of trend, because as I say, if we really need to, it is true that the social democrat, the social democracy in the post-war period was very much linked to the development of social rights within the national state. But as Luise was saying before, after Willy Brandt, each time is different, and we need different answers. And this time is different than the post-war world, this very nationalistic view. So I will say that we should move on this side, on this sort of nationalist receipt, even if within the economic governance we really need to allow this flexibility for each country. Otherwise, we will be doing things that people are not needing and really separating ourselves from the needs of people, and then people will not be voting for any progressive, but for other sort of populist and nativist alternatives.
This is very interesting because you are now introducing like these nationalist and populist kind of competitors, both competitors, and because at the end, what is very interesting, I think, from the last decades is that the competition has been more intense, and like the SD family have become more squeezed over the last decades by other party families. In this sense, Tarik, your work has insistently contradicted a popular claim. Socialist voters are massively flying to the radical right-wing parties. Basically, you find that this is wrong. Like, there's some losses to the radical right, but instead the evidence shows that most of the of them have found their new homes in the moderate right, as well as the Green and the left libertarian parties. What's more strategic for the social democratic parties? Trying to attract back centrist voters or leftist Green electorate? And if so, how? Because like social democratic parties could try to reinforce their traditional issues and try to appeal them with their kind of classic recipe, or they could also try to co-opt competing parties' agenda and try to be the vanguard of this type of like rather like leftist libertarian Green policies, or try to also compete with the nativist and radical right electorate, let's say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so there's several points on this. I think, and this already speaks to your last question a little bit. We see in every European country, and I usually focus more on Western Europe, this fragmentation of the political system, right? So we have more political competitors in nearly every country, and this means that the competitive context for social democratic parties is changing. What this also means is that we need to rethink what winning means for social democratic parties or for social democracy, right? Because social democratic parties in none of these countries are hegemonic anymore. I think except for Portugal and maybe the UK, no social democratic parties polling over 30%, right? So those parties will not just set the agenda on their own. So the question for winning, in my opinion, is how can social democratic parties create coalitions to implement social democratic policies? For that, of course, they need to win elections in a certain type of constellation. But then on the other hand, the question is also, what does the social democratic idea gain if social democratic parties themselves move far away from these positions, right? So the question is simply, does the Danish Social Democratic Party at the moment, and with its policy positions, still represent the ideal of social democracy? And if you have an immigration policy that's very similar to a radical right party, then nothing is gained by weakening this radical right party if suddenly another party represents this policy position. So this is a bit from this normative perspective. And then the second question is, empirically, analytically, how can these parties gain with these strategies? And you're right. What we found actually in an ongoing project with a lot of people, and we're having a workshop in the afternoon every day this week. So I'm very much refreshed my knowledge on this. We very much all agree that the social democratic parties have not lost a significant share of their electorate to the radical right. Their losses to more progressive parties by far outweigh the losses to the radical right. So this still doesn't solve the dilemma for social democratic parties, because social democratic parties have lost in all directions. However, what people forget is that there's another problem. They also haven't won anything, right? So social democratic parties in nearly every country have a negative trade balance with nearly every other party family. This is not necessarily because they've lost so many voters, but also in these structural changes, they have not gained new voters back. They haven't managed to set an agenda to have other people, younger people, for example, but also, you know, in changing social circumstances, people identify with this party group. And there, this is the final point. This is the question about the second dimension, or what people often call identity politics. These questions aren't going to go away. And I know many social democratic politicians hope they somehow would. They would magically disappear and social democracy could focus again on questions of redistribution and economic policy, where they're convinced that their electorate is not split. This is not going to happen. These issues are going to stay, and they're going to stay relevant, and they're particularly relevant for young people. And so if they want to bind a new share of the electorate to them, they need to formulate a progressive agenda on these identity politics issues. This is not going to magically revive them, but from everything we find in the long run, this is their only option, really. Because what we also find is that people who are economically left-wing, they also want social democratic parties who are more progressive. So there are many people who hold economically left-wing and, let's say, anti-immigrant attitudes. However, in their voting decision, what we find is reflected is that this is bundled into voting for more. So many of them don't care so much about immigration, right? So this is the people who are progressive and left-wing. They care more about what the Social Democratic Party is providing on this dimension. So in the longer term, our opinion is that really this more progressive direction is the only way where social democratic parties can go.
That is very interesting. I would like to know your opinion on this, Lina.
Yeah, well, is indeed very interesting. I was reading this morning, a small part of the research, and I agree. I think that it is not in front of the sort of radical right we are losing our voters, but also toward more left, but also to sort of conservative. But I think also it's because the framework is not easy for social democracy. I'm not only talking about sort of economic and deregulation rules, but also culturally. And that links with these identity issues, of course. But the neoliberal revolution has also changed, as Margaret Thatcher wanted, by the way, the soul of people. I mean, the heart of people, that has become more individualistic, more where consumerism is more and more important. The commodification of every single aspect of our life is not an easy task for a solidarity, a social justice proposal. Now we are facing this increased commodification as something very normal. Just think on sugar daddy issues. A lot of young women are convinced they are empowering themselves, using their bodies for sex or sport, or going with other people without thinking they are doing any prostitution, just using their kind of body capital or sexual capital, because everything is commodified. Within this framework, really it's really difficult to talk about solidarity with social justice, because everybody sort of the flow is very individualistic in a way. So I will say, yes, we have to take that into consideration, all these identity issues and so on and so forth, but and this is very important, without forgetting our promises of social justice, of dignity of every single person. So I think we should go at the center for redistribution, recognition, and representation, since we really need to advance also in democracy, and also a more, especially in the economic framework, we need more and more democracy, and we really need to talk, I think, very openly to society. I mean, I think this idea, this technocratic idea, we know better than society, or this populist idea, we know what the people thinks because we are the best to represent them. We have really need to put ourselves in a different framework, which is a new social contract that should be, by the way, a feminist social contract, no, that the one after the World War that was not. And also, we are also going, and I'm finishing, through this twin transition and the green transition. Of the green transition is not equally shared, and we really need to make that possible, and also to make democratic governance of the digital transition in order that the benefits are more equally shared than now. Forget this redistribution, pre-distribution, and distribution side, and the social justice promise and dignity of everybody that the social democracy is defending. But of course, as I say, redistribution, recognition, and representation should be the three of them at the same time.
Okay, so before going on, I wanted to tell to all the assistants, those who are listening to us, that they can also ask questions to Lina and to Tarik, and that we will basically transmit it to them and see what they have to say about it. You can do this in the questions and answers section on this button that is on the Zoom presentation. Okay, so I think something that Lina said is very compelling and goes together with what Tarik was also mentioning on the side of competition. So basically, there's this identity politics in which basically the like socialists are competing with other parties. So the point is that if they try to hold a more progressive agenda and try to lead a type of a social democratic coalition, they could try to compete with the Greens and with the left libertarians, but then maybe the whole electorate of the left wouldn't be so big, because they would be competing for the rather leftist electorate. While if they try to capture again those rather centrist voters who are probably not that to the left on the identity issues, or on even in economic dimension, maybe they are more liberal. If they manage to keep those voters or gather them back, maybe the whole the whole spectrum of the center left is bigger, and then forming a coalition it's something that is easier. How do you feel about this, like, Tarik? Is it like more strategic from a party perspective to compete for this rather leftist identity politics, but from a coalitional perspective or from a bloc perspective, more strategic thing to try to keep the centrists in?
Yes, so this is a very prominent idea, right? And I think this is interesting from a political science perspective because it shows how strongly political science thinking has shaped certain ways of thinking about politics, right? This is a very spatial logic, right? You have one block on the left and you have one block on the right. And in order to increase the left block, social democrats need to move right to win those voters who are there on the right. However, this is also a very simplified idea of how political appeals work. And even from a political science perspective, I think there are many things that speak against this idea. And I'll start with an example. And this is the example of the German Greens at the moment. So the German Greens have attracted a significant share of former CDU and even FDP, so mainstream right voters, who now support them. And this is in the last electoral cycle. And this is not because they have moved to the right. They're certainly at least as left-wing economically as the Social Democrats are. However, they managed to especially appeal on one issue. This is climate change. And this is an issue that somehow transcends simple left-right dimension. And these issues will come up over and over again. And so what parties, there are more factors that affect voting and that affect the share of the bloc than just the spatial idea of left, right, or being more centrist. So political parties need to set an agenda. They also need to develop a party brand and something we call issue ownership. And this can't happen from one election to the next. So Social Democrats are very much trying on the issue of climate change and the environment at the moment. However, people who really, really care about climate change, they will likely vote for a Green Party because they have developed that brand. But new things, new issues like this will come up. So digitalization and so on. So Social Democrats need to work on shaping a future-oriented agenda and also on shaping their own brand within this agenda. And because it's progressive politics, many of these issues will not be popular now, because this is the essence of progressive politics. So this is what Social Democrats need to do, is they also need to buy into issues that maybe don't have public support right now or don't have majority support, to establish a reputation on these issues that then will pay off in the mid-run. And maybe one thing on this idea of moving to the right, the center, becoming a little more centrist economically, a little more authoritarian nationalist, not brutally, but somewhat, to then extend the bloc. I think this is not unrealistic, but I think it's also important to know what this means for social democratic parties themselves. This will mean that social democratic parties themselves will not be the largest party in that left bloc anymore, right? They will probably then be reduced to, let's say, a 10 to 15%, depending on the country, share of more a petit bourgeois electorate who want these positions. Then this means that another, probably more left libertarian party will very likely be the largest party in this bloc. But what we've also seen is that those parties can actually form a coalition with the center right. So social democratic parties might sacrifice themselves for this left bloc, but then will wake up in a coalition that they're not necessarily part of. So especially from the position of those parties, I don't think this is a very attractive strategy.
It is very interesting. I don't know if Lina, you want to say something.
Yes, this conversation is very interesting indeed. I agree with Tarik in the sense that it will be things we are sort of that are very sort of core to the social democrat agenda, and that are not very popular now. And that it is easier, in my opinion, personally, is easier to arrive to a consensus about climate change and the Greens, so to concentrate it on that. But they are allowing a lot of other parts of the whole picture, of the whole political agenda to a very liberal way, which is the main flow now. And but we have to make clear that we really cannot advance in any sort of green free future without sort of tackling the increasing inequality we are living now. And that is something very central for our agenda. That should be one of these shaping our own agenda of the future. So we have to say, yes, of course, we want this green transition, but we want this green transition to be a fair transition. And we cannot really do it with the inequality we have now, because the burden of this transition is very unequal. I mean, people who are having more emissions, CO2 emissions, are the richest one in the world, that are accumulating more and more and more and more and more money, and having you know, a private airplane or wherever. And on the other hand, we cannot be asking people, so change the hour you put your washing machine. But we are watching at the television or at the internet all the time how these very rich people are living, and they are not assuming any of their part of this burden. So we really need to tackle these inequalities, and we really need to be able to transfer this idea that it is not only the green transition itself, we have to do it in front of green parties and so on and so forth, but this transition should be fair, and it will be not fair unless we tackle inequalities. And the sense is for liberal countries with this sense of freedom, which is the idea that we all have freedom to decide, but which kind of freedom? We all have the same freedom. We have also to be able to say that there are material preconditions that make our to have different choices or different level of freedom. We have also to be able to say that we have, for instance, gender issues, a different socialization that made us to choose in a different way, or we have different opportunities to that make us to change our choices and decisions. And also we really need to move idea that was very common in the last years of this that we are within meritocratic societies, because it is not true. We are not having the same opportunities. I will really need to make sure that we are not only talking about this equal opportunities when we are not in the process of allowing people to have this equal opportunities, but we should probably go back to talk more and more and more about equality in itself, and not only equal opportunities, or at least we have to make sure we are making possible these equal opportunities to happen, which is not happening now with education, which is not happening now with our participation in labor markets, or in housing, in property, in power, etc.
Okay, so that was actually also very interesting, Lina. Thank you. So we are arriving to the last 10 minutes of the talk, and we already have two questions. One is a longer than the other, but I will try to summarize the first one. So Antonio Arroyo asks a question on basically like how, like, he has two parts. So first part is well, he mentions that in Spain, for example, social democracy has strongly relied on identity politics in the last years, and this has came with kind of forgetting other issues, more traditional, transversal labor issues that could appeal to a broad economic type of voting. No. The thing is that and then he basically mentions that this is something that other parties, like radical right-wing parties, are starting to try to capture this type of discontent socialist ex-voters, but also at the same time when you appeal to identity politics, he says that you can find that even the same people you're trying to now to defend and to represent can end up fighting between each other because of feminist agenda having like a different agenda from the LGBTQI community. So to what extent he asked, I think to both, but you can both answer, but please not too long because we don't have a lot of time. To what extent social democracy should reflect deeply about about all this? Like, should they represent identity politics, and if so, should they be conscious about identity politics also involving some type of clashes between subgroups? You can, whoever you want can go first.
Well, the first thing, thank you, Antonio, for your question. Well, it is true that we have worked for identity policies in terms of recognition, because we had advanced is the party that has run on the homosexual wedding, or in the equality law, or gender violence law, many very important laws, and also the gender identity law that is now going on. So that is true. But on the other hand, in this last 3 years, we had advanced really a lot on sort of more classical social democratic policies regarding increasing minimum wages and many different aspects. So I think there is this combination which makes successful the PSOE and the Social Democrat party in Spain. As I was saying before, we should go at the same time with this distribution, recognition, and representation. And at the same time, we really need to make it that, and we really need to shape this future agenda, having in mind this thing, having in mind we are going through this digital and green transition, and we really need to make it in a very fair way. And for that, obviously, we need a social contract that is also a fiscal fiscality change. We really need to do it, but obviously this is something a country cannot do it on their own. We really need to think after the agreement G7 and the proposal from Biden and moving. Or I would like to see to believe we are moving towards a new fiscal era, and now maybe the flow is a bit more positive for social democratic proposals, not only in Spain, not only in Portugal, not only in Nordic countries, but in the whole world. And we really need to make possible that to shape this future progressive agenda in this new context of this new fiscal era. And as I say, also having in mind identitary policies, but without forgetting the redistribution and the redistribution side of our core proposals.
Okay, Tarik, do you want to add anything?
Yes, maybe just briefly. So I'm certainly not an expert on Spanish politics, so I won't say this is what has happened in Spain. But this idea, this narrative exists in other countries as well, right? So the social democratic parties now primarily focus on so-called identity politics. And with every indicator that we have, this is simply not true. Social democratic parties still mostly talk about the economy and redistribution and the welfare state, and this is really what these parties emphasize. And we've seen that generally there has been a shift where, to a certain degree, new issues have come onto the agenda that could be labeled identity politics, but also other issues like health, for example, is maybe not primarily a redistributive issue, education that has several aspects. So it's not that social democratic parties at all only talk about identity politics. And the second is then, well, what does this idea that identity politics now is kind of, segregating the population and is creating this conflict. So then I think we need to answer, what does identity politics mean? And the idea of identity politics is that those who are negatively affected by structures of discrimination, oppression, and so on, should primarily be themselves should be the first to formulate how we can change the situation and to describe this negative situation. And this is this is the idea of social democracy. The history of social democracy is one of identity politics. Of course, what the labor movement formulated in the 19th century is exactly this: is to represent themselves and to be politically in charge, to change the situation, to get universal suffrage, to get female suffrage, right, as an additional goal in this, and to represent themselves. And so the history of social democracy really is a history of identity politics, and this is not something that has only started in the last 15 years or so.
Okay. Thank you. So to wrap up, the last question would be one from Christian Testor from the Ebert. So he says, in a few words, Tarik, can you explain who is the average European voter of social democratic parties? Do the voters have something in common, like average income, age, sex, political views? Who is the left and the social democratic voter?
Yeah. So this is, it's not easy to say this is generally true throughout all countries. I think one thing that many social democratic parties share at the moment, and this is a fundamental problem for them, is age as a category. So the voters are old. In the Netherlands, the electorate of the Social Democrats is as old as the electorate of the Pensioners Party. In Germany too, the largest group that still supports the SPD is the over 70-year-olds. And among the under 30-year-olds, there's very little support for social democracy in many countries. So this is a fundamental challenge for social democracy, that many of them change. There is this generational change that's not only age, but cohort-based. Younger cohorts are now increasingly shifting to left libertarian, green, some radical left parties, and away from social democracy. And so this is something that they share. The second thing is that, yes, social democracy in all European countries today represents more middle-class professionals compared to working-class voters than they did, let's say, 30 years ago. But what's important to see is the massive structural change that's behind this development. There is just a development in all Western Europe, and I read maybe Portugal and Greece are the only countries that are a bit lagging behind us. Is this massive upgrading in terms of education and this turn to what we call the knowledge society. So we simply have the working class is simply much smaller today, and there's and this is accelerating, and it has happened in the last 20 years. But there's massive educational upgrading in Germany today. 60% of 20-year-olds go to university. So if social democracy did not have this significant share of professionals and educated middle-class voters, then they would be even worse off, because this is an increasingly large part of the electorate. And so this is also a development that they share, but this is something that's very much structurally driven. And it's not that they have overproportionally lost working class voters. In contrast, they've actually overproportionally lost middle-class voters in the last 20 years. So it's more the structurally driven element that they need to adjust to. This is also something basically all social democratic parties have in common.
And sex, women, we vote more for social democrats parties than others. It's very clear here. The European Parliament, more of gender mainstreaming representative from the S&D, and we are really the party putting all the feminist mainstreaming in every single aspect in the European politics. So and of course that should be reflected in the voting, and normally it is. As far as I know, that's your expertise, not mine.
Again, really, this depends on the country, and we've seen so gender has not been a huge dividing line in terms of voting behavior up until 15 years ago in most countries. But what we always know is that the radical right gets less support from women, and the parties again that now attract more women, and especially educated women, are again green, progressive, left libertarian parties, and not necessarily social democratic parties. There's also an age relationship, so age and gender combined. Young educated women have left social democratic parties over proportionally for these types of left libertarian green parties where they exist.
This is not the case of Spain. Spain is more the socialist party. It's sort of there's a gender divide there.
Yeah, the Socialist Party is, of course, the Spanish Socialist Party is, of course, one that has, as you mentioned early on, tried to formulate an explicitly feminist agenda, which other social democratic parties haven't done.
Okay, so I think this is like a good point of to finish this talk. We have reached the hour. I think it has been a pleasure for me to participate in this talk with two voices that are generally not talking in public together. One coming from the academia, from the expertise. Also, the other one coming from the academia because she's an academic. But also now in politics and in a very relevant position, both in the Spanish Socialist Party, but also in the European one. So I wanted to thank you both for being here today, and yeah, I hope to see you and hear you soon and read you soon as well. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So, and for the rest, I wanted to also thank the viewers for being here and listening to us. Also, Christian Testorf and Antonio Arroyo for asking two questions, very interesting questions actually. And yes, I invite you to follow Agenda Pública and the Ebert-Stiftung Foundation in the following months, because we will start and continue basically publishing articles and having interviews, and also holding this type of sessions in which we invite experts in social democracy from different type of spheres. So thank you everyone again for being here, and I hope to see you soon again in following sessions.